Welcome to day 7 of my Valentine series. Today we will be painting a lock and key duo. So we started with a simple outline and I'm using a kneaded eraser to get rid of some of those harsh pencil lines. For the gold portions of the lock and key, I'll be using Hansa Yellow Light, heavily diluted. For the heart portion, I would typically do a little bit more of a defined look, but this time I'll be doing a looser watercolor style. So because I want to blend out the colors on the heart portion, I'm only going to do half of the yellow and then I'll leave a portion completely white because that's where my highlight will be. After wetting the area, I'm going to use quinacridone rose, a little diluted, and I'll just drop in color loosely at the bottom of the heart and work my way up towards the yellow. For the areas with a little bit too much water, I'm using a brush to sop up the excess. I'm also using a damp brush to help with the hard edges as the colors blend together. The quinacridone rose I'm also using as a shadow color for the top of the lock. This is the part where I completely dry it and start wetting the area again so I can drop in even more color. I'm still using that quinacridone rose, but a little less diluted, and I'm trying to get the spaces anchored so that it can look a little bit more dimensional. I'm still using that damp brush to help soften the edges, and I'm just going over all of the places that I previously did with the quinacridone rose and darkening it a tad. I'm also taking the Hansa Yellow Light and darkening it a tad and adding a little bit just so I can add a little bit of depth while it bleeds into the rose. The gold portion of the lock and key needs some shadow work, so I had a little bit of a darker tone on my palette. It was a Hansa Yellow Light mixed with some yellow ochre mixed with a dab of burnt sienna. I'm using this to outline all of the gold portions of the lock and key and using that damp brush to blend it out. In order to look a little bit more 3D, I'm adding a shadow on the inside line of the lock. I'm going to wet the area where I'll be dropping in some color. I'm mixing some cerulean blue with ultramarine blue and just dropping in a little bit of a darker outline, and I'll use the same color for adding shadow. I put a drop of the quinacridone rose back on my brush just because the shadow at the very top looked a little flat. I'm going to add some raw umber to my mixture for the lock and key so that I can add an even more darker shadow. The layering effect will help it to become less flat. I'm using this color to darken that inner line, and I'm also going to darken the areas closest to the heart portion. I'll use whatever is left over on my brush to lightly outline the heart. Now it's time to completely dry it again so that we can add our next layer. We'll wet the area that we previously darkened and we'll add a little bit of Payne's Gray to our blue mixture and drop that in. This is the ugly phase of the painting where everything looks flat and the colors don't seem to be mixing very well, but you just have to trust the process and keep going. Because the metal buttons got covered, we'll outline them with that same blue mixture and blend it out with a damp brush. We'll be using this shadow to further outline and darken the shadow. In order to help the transition of the mixing colors, I'm adding some quinacridone rose with a touch of pyrrole scarlet, and I'm just dropping it in right on the line of where the blue and the pink are mixing. And I'll use a damp brush to help it along and to smooth those edges. When I'm returning to my palette, I'm not really worried if there is a little bit too much pyrrole scarlet on my brush or a little bit too much quinacridone rose. It adds dimension to the color when I'm dropping it in. And then it's time to completely dry it again before adding my next layer. I'm wetting the area where I'm going to drop in that same quinacridone rose, but this time with a little less water and more concentrated color. I'm using the same color to go over the darker blue areas, and it helps the shadow to look a little bit more cohesive. And then diluting it a touch so I can add a shadow on the right side of the buttons and blending it out. I'm continuing to layer as each layer is drying, and that way it's a little bit darker in certain areas, it's creating shadow in certain areas, and I'm helping to outline spaces. I'm using that same Payne's Gray and blue mixture to create a darker area on the inside of the keyhole. I'm leaving the left side a sliver of white because I'll do extra layers on the right side and middle and keep that sliver a little bit lighter. I'll be adding a highlight to the right side, so I'm not too worried about making it a perfect shape. I went back in to darken the outline on the right side of the heart, and then I added another layer to the inside of the keyhole and covering up that left sliver so that it's a tad lighter. I'm also adding another layer to the shadow on the gold portions of the lock and key. I'm doing that with that same raw umber mixture and just layering on top and blending it out with a damp brush. I'm putting a few more shadows on the key, underneath the rings, and on the inside lining of the heart. And then I'm just darkening up any areas that seem like they need to be a little bit darker before completely drying it. I use that same mixture with the Payne's Gray and blue in order to create this cast shadow. I just heavily diluted it with water. I'm making the cast shadow quite defined, but I'm still using a damp brush to blend it out softly, and then I'll deepen the shadow as it gets closer to the object. But I'm keeping my damp brush at the ready so I can blend it out. Once I'm happy with my cast shadow, I completely dry it so that I can start on the highlight. I'm adding a highlight on the gold portion of the lock right down the middle, but I'm blending it out with a damp brush. I'm also adding a larger highlight on the left side of the heart portion, which is what I left completely paint free in the beginning of the painting, and I'm blending it out with a damp brush. Little tiny highlights around the keyhole and on the buttons, and still making sure to blend it out and creating a very, very thin line on the outline of the heart as well as the outline of the front of the heart. For the key, I'll add a highlight all around the heart and down the center as well as on the rings. I'm just looking for where the light source would hit it and where it would shine, making sure to blend it out so that it's not so harsh. And once I'm done with my highlights and blending them out, then it's done. This is how it looks in natural light. I hope you enjoyed painting with me, and I hope to see you in the next video.